And it was just one part of the Academy, BBC Academy's training function. What became quite clear relatively soon, and partly under the pressure of financial, I want to say cutbacks, it's not as severe as cutbacks, but finances as any business is, we needed to look at how we changed the Academy. But also for learning design to be effective, we needed our colleagues within the Academy, our trainers, our face-to-face colleagues, to really understand and develop their own skills and experience and knowledge of learning experience design. So it became a partnership, because there was this real bad synapse of, oh, well, it's them and us. And actually learning design shouldn't be them and us. Learning design should be a partnership between people who are experts in designing the experience and understanding the users, and then people who are experts in the business and the subject matter. So that's the early phase of it, where we got into then the bigger phase, which is actually, let's transform the Academy, because it's the right thing to do. You know, we want to modernise learning. We're working in a BBC where we've got to be able to upskill and reskill our staff quickly. We want to drive that culture of learning so that it's self-development and it's self-initiated, rather than us pushing mandatory or compliance boring training all the time. But, you know, it just met the need. It felt the right thing for an organisation like ourselves to be doing.
Great. And you know, I imagine that came along with many, many challenges along the way. Namely, you know, you came from the product world and the marketing background and moved into the learning world. Tell me what was your approach to bring the learning organisation on that journey? What was your approach to get them, you know, first of all, get them on board before you can then march off into the organisation and triumphantly talk about the new learning modules and designing process that you'd introduced?
Yeah, part of that came from my absolute passion. So I'm quite a curious person, and I like to learn myself. So I spent a long time really understanding modern L&D practices, what's working, what's not working. I think personally, I hear a lot of people on the circuit, on the speaker circuit, talking about the old, you know, courses, not resources, this, not that, everything else. But I'm not sure that, I think those things are brilliant in a purist point of view, but I'm not sure when you're actually in the depths of a big global organisation, whether it's as simple as to just go down a courses, not resources, resources, not courses route, or whatever else. So I really took elements of all of the things that I was hearing out of L&D and thinking, how can we apply that to our own thinking? And then really, a lot of it was me and my colleagues, convincing my colleagues, showing them what we could be doing differently. We did a few pilots. So in the embers of creating this learning experience design team, before we got to that point, I did a pilot to show how, if you took this user-centered project principles from the product world and applied it to learning, what the outcome could be. And it was really interesting, because it was the classic case of one of our divisions coming forward and saying, we've got a real problem with people being creative. So we ran through some user-centered design workshops. We did some discovery phases. We did some business workshops. And actually what we found out in the end of it is there was no problem at all with creativity. The problem was around some of the leadership skills, some of the time management skills. They just didn't have the time to be creative. So if we'd have taken that commission at face value, we would have created some lovely creativity training, but that wouldn't have solved the problem. So using that as an example helped me influence the Academy SMT to approach a different way of thinking. And then, so that started our change. But also, I think what we're doing is working with the business itself now to say, let's try a few of these things with people within the business that want to change. Let's try and do something differently if you're open to trying to do something differently. What we're not doing is banging on the doors of people that are saying, oh, no, we don't want to change. What's happening is, as a result of the change that we're making in some of the business areas, those other business areas are now banging on our door saying, help us change. So it's been quite interesting. It sounds easy. It's been a long and hard journey, and it's very much about using the evidence that's there, the lobbying skills, the the promise that, you know, we will do a good job for you, just trust me. So there's the trust and the faith. And I think, you know, that there is that part of passion that's it's a bit catching, isn't it? So sometimes if people can really believe your passion and your energy in it, then they're going to give you the trust to go ahead with it. So it's been a lot of conversations, a lot of showing, a lot of talking, a lot of theoretical evidence as well, because we haven't at that point delivered a lot into the BBC. And just getting those trust of a few to start the ball rolling, much like, you know, making a snowball. It never really compounds to begin with, and then eventually you get there.
Yeah, and you know, those challenges can be they can really stop that snowball in its tracks.
Oh yes, yeah. I have my favourite analogy. I know one of my colleagues is on the call today. My favourite analogy is we quite often have to lose a battle to win a war. And, you know, if you take that analogy, in any of the world wars, we didn't win every single battle. So sometimes if someone has asked you for a piece of compliance training and it has to be like this, and I want it to be written, it's not worth the battle if they're not willing to change, because it's always going to be difficult. So it's far better starting with people that want to change, that want to try and do something differently, and then using that to affect change later on. So I'm very good at sitting back and saying, do you know what? Let's take this one as it is. If in a perfect world we would have done it completely differently, but the circumstances weren't right. So let's take this one as it is, but let's apply all of our thought and our passion and everything else onto the next one that comes along.
Such valuable advice. And someone a long time ago told me, pick and choose your battles. And
exactly.
That stuck with me well during my corporate days, because it is a challenge to win over stakeholders, business partners, and even your own team. You know, when you're talking about transforming learning and development, it starts with the people around you to ensure that they're ready and they're on board to go out and share that message. So hopefully what we're talking about, our listeners are identifying with this in some way, shape or form. And it'd be great to see some comments, any questions come forward in the chat box, and we'll jump back to those shortly. So let's continue on the theme of challenges. So tell me, you know, what were some of your biggest challenges? What, you know, really kept you up at night?
Yeah.
When it's time to implement these changes?
So I think just picking back up from what you've just said, one of our biggest challenges was bringing our team with us. So yeah, we had this lovely new learning experience design team that had been established and put together for that reason. Yet within the academy, we had 50 odd training staff who, just to explain, our academy trainers aren't L&D professionals, they're subject matter experts. So they were the best people at producing programs, the best people at creating good quality video out of production systems. They were the best quality journalists, everything else. So we had to really bring them on this journey of being blended. Doing a different approach to learning doesn't mean that you're any less important than you are now, and B, you don't need to be standing up in front of a classroom to get people to understand your subject area. Actually, you can have a far bigger and better reach if you looked at it differently. So quite early on, we knew that was the first thing that we needed to overcome, was actually we needed to transform ourselves before we could transform the business. Because actually, if you just look, you know, a small team of senior management team going out and trying to transform the business is one thing, but if you've got the rest of the academy doing the same thing, that snowball is going to get bigger much quicker. So we invested in ourselves, essentially, and we designed a blended learning program to help trainers understand what blended learning was, how all the different ways you could experience learning, whether that be through an online webinar, whether that be through drop-in sessions, whether that be through some of the interactive activities that you could do outside of it, from simple things such as checklists to more involved things such as game mechanics. And we ran that program over 6 months with weekly sessions, with Yammer group supports, with tasks and all sorts of things basically for people to get involved in. And that didn't just come from me as the person of learning experience design. It came from me and someone in the business, one of my colleagues in the SMT, who she'd quite happily say was a bit of a skeptic about doing things differently. So they had this voice of this voice that mirrored the voice of the trainers, so it made it more compelling. So in that time, we really got our training team to understand what they could be doing differently. That then enhanced the conversations that we were having with business. It enhanced the conversations that they were having with the learning design team. And already we're seeing the types of things that we're developing change and get better, basically, the experience that we're delivering and moving away from this. So that in itself was a challenge. I have to apologise. I just realised my dog's picked up a squeaky toy. So if he starts squeaking it, I'll remove it from him.
That's all right.
So that was our first challenge. Our second challenge, I think, has actually been convincing the business that an ongoing blend of learning is better than sitting people in a classroom and telling them something face to face. So, for example, one of the projects that I've been working on, it's very much about culture change. And the request we got was we'd like to get all of the people in our division in the classroom and tell them about this new culture that we want to employ, how the skills that they need to be able to adapt to this culture, and then job done, tick, we'll leave them and get on with it. What I've needed to do is work with them to convince them that actually if they really want true culture change, they need to have an ongoing programme that supports them and develops them. And that's been counteracted. They don't do digital, they don't like digital. We'll get them in a classroom, we know they've all done it then. So we've had this real set of conversations where I use feedback from going and speaking to the learners down on the ground to play back to the SMEs, the stakeholders that are requesting the work, to say, that's what you think, but actually down on the ground, this is what people are saying. And we get to a place where this isn't a losing the battle, this is a sort of let's get to stalemate, I suppose, in the war analogies. It's a let us prove that by doing something differently, we can change your culture more effectively. So we get to a happy medium. So I think that bit is probably the most challenging bit. And I think we're beginning to make inroads to that. And I can see that through the types of requests and conversations on where they're coming from now within the different divisions of the BBC. But I would say that for anyone undergoing this sort of program, that's the hardest bit, because I think from a stakeholder perspective, ticking the box to say, yeah, we've done the learning, tick, and we did it on the classroom is the easiest thing for them to do. To think more widely about an ongoing culture transformation, which means that learning has to be continuous, so they have to think about it over a long period of time, is a harder ask of them.
Yeah, and it's that holistic view to learning and development that's sometimes missed out by stakeholders. And in a minute, we'll come back to Hayden to reflect on what's going on in the chat box. But when we come back, I really want to delve in a bit more around stakeholders, because taking stakeholders on a journey can invariably mean pushing yourself and those stakeholders through the pain points. Yes. And that can be a real challenge in itself. Trust me, I know that from some of my previous roles. Okay, so Hayden, how are things looking in the chat box?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, we've got some really great interactions from people coming through. So some comments around the feeling of empathy with the disheartening at times when you're trying to face the wrong challenge. So you're choosing the battles to win, I think has really resonated with people in the chat there. And some real interest in your story about driving a common goal and the needs of people and really engaging and collaborating with the business around that. So some kudos from Genevieve there on nicely done to Jenny for the work that you did around there, which is great. Again, it's important of connecting with the business and taking the business with you on the journey is coming through. And I loved the talk that you had around getting beneath the symptoms that you were given to really see what the true cause is. That diagnostic phase was really, really important. And this sense of not having to do it by yourself, but engaging with the business coming out as well from Julia in the comments there. I'm loving the idea of showing that results you can get from a different approach. So a couple of questions that have come in, which maybe just quickly talk into. So one from Fiona, who's asking, what skills do you think we need to be building in our learning department? So maybe, Jenny, you can kind of maybe just quickly talk into...
Yeah, I think from my perspective, remember, I come at it from learning experience design. I think you have to have really good communication skills. I know that sounds like an old adage, you'd be good at communicating. When I say communication skills, you've got to be able to facilitate a conversation. You've got to be able to offer challenge. You've got to almost be able to reflect back to them what they're asking of you so that they can see that it sounds a bit crazy, so they can hear it back again. I think you've got to be quite strong in that communication. You've got to be able to really dig into and ask the questions that they haven't thought about. So I think there's that thing of communication, that natural ability of being a bit nosy. So, digging in a bit more, asking the why question and not feeling uncomfortable about it. That element of being able to understand people, to really be able to have, and again, it comes down to conversation, but be able to really understand people and ask them in a real sort of coaching almost way, what is it, how is it coming to be like that, why is it like that? So you've got really open answers, because by surveying users, that's just not enough. People are going to give you yes or no. You really have to be able to have people that can dig into and investigate. It's that journalistic nous, I suppose, of what's really going on beneath the lines. I think, within the Academy, we've established an Academy Business Partner Network. That's not new. I know lots of companies do that. It's new for us at the BBC. And that is having an impact, being able to really influence at a high level so that people can think differently. What I would say, and I think one of the things that we not necessarily failed at, we had brilliant people that made amazing content, but they weren't necessarily people that thought about whether that content was the right. Just because we're the BBC and just because we're training the people that make our TV programmes, that make our news, does it mean that they have to have the most flashy, the most all singing and dancing experience? Because the need might be as simple as having a checklist to show you how to post something on Facebook, for example. So I think it's people that can really challenge the status quo and can think outside the box, but don't think in the realms of solutioneering. So the solution comes a bit later. They think in the realms of discovery and that nosiness, that interest, that discovery phase is so critical. Then that leads you into the design phase. And I think quite a lot of from instructional design type roles come at it from what's the solution rather than what's the actual need, what's the problem we're trying to solve. So it's like really getting into that problem side of things. So I think that's where I'd say your people need to be more problem orientated than more solution orientated to start with.
Fantastic, thank you. So just another question that's come in here. So a couple of questions actually, and maybe I'll pitch these both to you. You can talk into them both together perhaps. Is one question which is around how do you use data to back up what's working well to get the buy-in, and maybe linked to that is what messages are the exec team giving out to make this important to the business? So maybe we can talk into those two topics together.
Okay, with the data one, I'd love someone to come and tell me the magic formula of how we gather that data. So one of the things that has sort of stifled us in a way, or not stifled us, but been a slight pain, is that our data collection systems aren't brilliant. So that's something that we're putting in as part of the learning journey. And what we're trying to look at is things like reach, engagement and consumption of materials. But importantly, if with the conversations with the stakeholders at the outset, we can understand the outcome clearly, then that needs to be a measurable outcome. We can then measure against it. So, for example, in the BBC, we have viewing figures, radio figures for radio. Whilst we can't attribute every increase in figures to learning, if we're looking at a specific outcome that affects that set of figures, then we can say, well, learning probably had an impact on that. So it's not a science, it's not a pure science, but we're trying to find ways that the business can tell us through the metrics that the business records that learning may have had an impact to that. Does that make sense? And sorry, what was the other part of that question?
The other question was around what messages are the executive team giving out to make this important for the business? So how do you get that exec support and buy-in? And
So the exec bought into it. I mean, obviously, to do this transformation, we had to sell it to them in the first place. We've had great support in it. I'm not entirely sure whether that support has come with a full understanding of what we want to try and do to create a learning culture. But in saying that, we're continuing to have really great conversations with our execco, looking at how learning supports wider transformation in the BBC. So that's an ongoing conversation, I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you. So Richard, I'll hand back to yourself to
great, thank you.
With your questions.
Some great questions there, guys. Keep them coming. Okay, so I just want to, and you talked a little bit around winning over stakeholders. Earlier on, we were talking about moving away from being perceived in a learning organisation as order takers through the stakeholders' eyes. And I know that's really hard sometimes to do that. And in fact, when you start to educate your stakeholders on the different modalities of learning, and in fact, classroom face-to-face facilitation is only one of, it's mind-boggling the different modalities and formats of learning these days. The modern learner just expects more. Sometimes the stakeholders aren't on board with that. So what's the secret sauce? You're sitting there in front of some very challenging individuals. I've had a few in my time. How do you win them over?
Secret sauce. Well, I think it's a combination of things, because I can't sit here and say, oh, I did it all myself. Part of it is the relationship between myself and the Academy business partners. So what we've been doing, this is all about comms now. It's about comms to start with. What we've been doing is myself and the relevant business partners for each area have been going out and doing almost a lobbying campaign, talking about why learning has to change, about people's expectations, not just because in our life now it's easy to pick up one of these, Google what we need to know, and job done. So we talk about the modern life, we talk about the brain and how the brain works, and how sitting people in a classroom is the most ineffective way of getting people to remember information if it's important. We talk also, which is, I think that you'll find this in every business, is that businesses can't afford people to be out of the office for days on end, and that's usually the turning point, is when you face someone with where you've got your staff and percentage of your staff out of the office for this period of time, and in that period of time, when they come back after 60 days, they're only going to remember 10% of it. Was that actually viable? was that worth it? So a lot of it is about that comms piece. We've got internal comms campaigns going on at the same time, pushing this sort of learning at work, this self-directed learning. We want to get to a place where our learners are just doing learning in the course of work without any intervention from their managers, without anything else. They're just picking up stuff and getting on with it because it's there and it's there for them. So I think it's very much about the conversation and the comms. And then in doing that, getting the trust and the faith in you that you can deliver.
Yeah, and internal comms is so important. And obviously, you've got a marketing background. To comms in a moment, and interestingly, our very first in conversation virtual hangout was around marketing and communication. So if any viewers today are wanting to review that in conversation session we had, you can actually see the recording on our BrainFood YouTube channel. And we had a really interesting discussion on that topic.
Yeah. Comms, I mean, not just in influencing the stakeholders, but in the learning experiences themselves. You can't expect people to just go and find it. Some of them might if they've got an interest. But the more a learning, I look at them as learning campaigns, the more learning is supported by comms, the more it's going to drive the engagement and drive the awareness of that activity. So, for example, we've got the general election coming up, obviously. Within a week of it being announced, we've got an election collection of learning resources available, and that's being promoted through roadshows, through internal comms activity that is supporting the election. So through the roadshows, we have digi-screens in all of our buildings, we've got email channels, all of that. So it's finding a place for the learning materials that support whatever activity is going on in the norm of the internal comms activity.
I mean, one would imagine at the BBC, you've just got a treasure chest of internal comms and marketeers and talent available at your disposal. So, I mean, tell us what really was your most successful internal learning marketing strategy? What was it all about?
I suspect I'm thinking. I think the most successful one we probably have was when we took on LinkedIn Learning. So it's not actually about any of the learning that we created ourselves, but what we did was we bought LinkedIn Learning to be able to supplement and support, so that we were concentrating our efforts on creating the brilliant stuff which is bespoke to the BBC. So we did a huge campaign with internal comms around LinkedIn Learning, and it was sort of a X many days to go type of campaign, and then it's launched, give it a go. And then we've had a number of internal comms competitions. We've had a photography competitions, which mean that you need to have done a bit of learning in LinkedIn Learning to then enter the competition. And that has been a purely internal comms driven campaign, using the resources that are available from us. And the effect has been brilliant. The sign up to LinkedIn Learning has been great, but the feedback that we're getting about LinkedIn Learning is also great. So that's been really effective. And I think where we've got big campaigns, I mean, even for some of our mandatory training, we had quite a low completion rate. We did a big campaign about, it was dated back in the 80s with old cassette tapes and things like that, a bit of a fun spin on it, but got people to stop and think, okay, I need to update myself on my mandatory training during summer months or during quiet periods. So we use internal comms to quite good effect. What works well is we've got the most amazing graphic designer, so he can really create something that grabs attention. So it's always very beautifully designed, but very impactful in grabbing your attention. So I think those sort of things, internal comms, a brilliant graphic designer and a bit of a quirky take on what it is that you're trying to get a message out, rather than just saying, get up to date on your internal comms. Something that makes you look and go, oh, what's that? So you go away and engage with it.
And we all know what a pain point completing mandatory learning is in any
organisation. Oh, absolutely. And our completion rates have gone up quite significantly, not just through those campaigns, but they are moving that way.
That's great. And so, tell me, when you have things like mandatory learning, which, face it, is like pulling teeth with some team members to get it completed. How do you utilise your perhaps on-screen talent? Is that something that you do? Does that engage learners? For example, do you tap Nick Knowles on the shoulder and say, hey, can you help us do an internal communication around fire safety training? So
you'll be interested to know that is a big put off. It's a big no-no for our learners. So yeah, absolutely. We did once upon a time tap Nick Knowles on the shoulder and get him to present our safety training. And because we're reinventing our mandatory training as well as part of this programme of work. So when we started researching our learners, understanding how they engage with it, the biggest thing that they felt was the fact that we used talent was really inauthentic, and actually we should be using BBC people. So the only time we use talent, what we call talent, in our courses is where they're subject matter experts. So for example, We've got courses in two-way TV, so when you have a conversation from the newsroom out to a journalist, that's generally someone who is adept in that. So maybe Hugh Edwards could be in that. If it is information about when we did the EU referendum, it was the Brussels reporter that headed up that information. So we'll use people carefully depending on whether or not their subject matter expertise is what the course needs. But quite often we'll just use the people, our staff.
Wow. Well, there you go. You learn something new every day. That's really interesting that actually using some of the on-screen talent turns people off. Well, it's all about engagement, learner engagement. And Hayden, how's our engagement looking in the chat box?
Great. So thanks, Richard. Thanks, Jenny. Some really great input from the two of you there. So a few kind of comments coming through. So suggestion from Jen, when we're going back to our conversation about data, maybe taking a more personal insight-based data collection, asking outright what people think about some of their experiences and how do you build that so more qualitative rather than quantitative. And I guess
we do that as well. We do have focus groups and post-learning surveys and all sorts of things that take that, what do you think? Then we use that to iterate the next version of it. So yeah, absolutely. Fantastic,
great stuff. And one of the comments that came later was how do you kind of achieve that at scale? So to get enough of that information to make it worthwhile.
And also what we find is, you can get quite polarizing opinions. So how many opinions in one way lead you to making a change in the course? So, it's an interesting one.
It is, absolutely, and I think you've articulated earlier, it's that blend between that qualitative and then some of the more looking at your reach, your engagement, and your consumption to combine those two data sources. So great insight there. Comment from Fiona coming through, just in time, just for me, and just the right amount, which I love that as a phrase. Everybody is now in this individualization of their learning journey. So how do I get learning that's right for me at the right time, in the right way? So great to hear you talk into some of that earlier on. And then we just got comments around some of your experiences around the internal comms and how do you encourage people to take on board some of the learning. So comment just from Julia there about marketing departments do this so well with customer insights. So what can we as L&D professionals learn from our marketing colleagues about when they do this with the consumer market versus our own internal consumer market?
Absolutely. I always say, we should be marketing ourselves in the same way that we're marketing our product out to our customers. So very much that's the principles that I like to look at is if what would we do internally and why wouldn't we do that? What would we do externally and why on earth wouldn't we do that internally?
Fantastic. Great comments. So yeah, some really good engagement coming through. So keep that coming, guys, and I'll hand back over to Richard.
Great. Thanks very much, Hayden. I think for me, it was the same manager that told me pick and choose your battles, Richard, that also said, in the absence of data, relationships are key. And when I spoke to you, when I asked you earlier on about what the secret sauce is, you talked about relationships and that being very powerful. But let's just jump back to data for a minute and explore that. And I'm really intrigued to understand how you've set the scene and told the story with your stakeholders around how you plan to measure learning impact across the business, both immediately and longer term.
So just to start, remember we're quite early on into this journey, so we don't have a lot of results at the moment. But what we're looking at is, so at the moment, the data that satisfies the stakeholder is a tick in the box to say that course has been complete. But what you don't know from that tick in the box is whether that course has then changed the behaviours, which has then had an everlasting change into the business practices. So what we're looking at is what is the problem you're trying to solve, but how will things have changed in your department, in your division, to tell you that that problem's been solved. We can then start applying some measurable measurements to that. So, if the outcome is we get less emails into our service centre, or we get more people inquiring about X because we want to drive inquiries, or we get less complaints to the editorial standards or whatever they are, there's some things that we can measure there. I mean, equally, not everything's measurable, so some of it is going to have to go on that more qualitative data. So it's really about, and we really put it on our stakeholders to try and think about and work out what the measurements that they're looking for or what those outcomes are, rather than us going and saying, well, we can measure this by, we could do a survey, we could take an NPS, we could see how many people have completed it, because I don't think that is what we're there to do. We are there to deliver really great learning, but that really great learning has a reason. The reason is it's impacting the business. It's impacting the business to behave differently. So what is it that is the real indicator that that's happened? So that's what we're challenging the business to do. Have we got there yet? No, by no means, we haven't. We, alongside all of this, a bit like one of the questions that just came up before, we're implementing a learning records store. We're looking at things like XAPI data. We're looking at things like feedback data, even ratings. We've been talking about how things like Trustpilot and FIFO work. So we want to get a rich set of data, but I think until we get that data, and we're very lucky because we've got some great data analysis that work at the BBC. Once we get that data, we can look at it and see what it's telling us. So I think there's a business element to it, is what is it you're trying to change and how can we measure that that's been changed? And I think there's this unfound element yet that we're looking at, which is we're just pulling in all of this data, this big data at the moment, and then looking at what it tells us, what trends it's showing us, what, even to the extent of where in the point in the course have you lost people, where in the point of your course that actually by the time they got to X way through a learning intervention, they knew everything that they needed to do. So is the next 80% worth it? So we're playing with data at the moment, I think is the best way to describe that.
Yeah, and quite often, from my experience, it's a journey with the stakeholders. And I really liked when you said, to get their input and get their investment in how they see they would get the data. It's not just the L&D's team responsibilities to harvest that data. Yeah. How is the stakeholder going to support that and facilitate that? And what are they going to do? What tools do they have that they can collaborate with the L&D team to produce that data?
I find as well as it engages the stakeholder more, because the more that they're engaged, the more involved in the success of the project they are. So we've got we've got a number of projects that are on hold almost because the stakeholder's not that engaged. It's clearly not that important in terms of everything else. So the learning stuff that they want to get out just takes a back seat. Where we're really engaging with the business, where we're really challenging them to think differently, and where we're challenging them to take ownership, we're seeing great engagement and we're seeing things happen more quickly and more effectively. And I'm sure that's because we've made it a joint thing. It's a joint ownership. There's a joint responsibility to deliver effective learning, rather than saying, right, okay, I've told you what I want, off you go and do it. So it's a very different type of relationship we're experiencing.
Mm. And quite often the stakeholders and leaders will explain quite freely what the pain points are, what's not working, why it's not working, what they've tried in the past, and what frustrations they have. And whilst you sympathise with that pain point, you also need to try and get under the skin of, well, why haven't things worked? How have you measured against those pain points? It could be that in the absence of data, you go back and say, well, if we manage to alleviate some of those pain points, then clearly we're doing something that's working here, and we test, learn and evolve. And
quite often it's that data that we go and gather from talking to our users that tells us what we need to do to our learners, because the stakeholder can quite nicely sit down and tell you all of those pain points. When you sort of play them back in a way to the learners themselves, they go, oh yeah, that's because of this, that and the other, or that's because we need X, Y and Z. So quite often they know the answer, and we can go and use that as data. So it's not numbers, but we can use that to reflect back to say, look, your people are telling you this. and we can go back to those people at the end of the program or in the middle of the program to say, okay, are things improving? Have you got better knowledge? What should, and measure that skills gap. So I think there's so many ways you can look at data, and it's trying to play with a few and see what it tells you.
I totally agree. And historical data really does shape the future. And the future looks really exciting. And in a moment, we'll talk about what the future in learning holds. But Hayden, back over to you.
So just a couple of more comments coming through. So just comments around the beauty of L&D is where you support your colleagues in other business areas to succeed. It's not about our achievements, it's about theirs.
Absolutely.
Truly getting that, understanding that our role is to support. Lovely comment coming across from Nicola there. And just a kind of comment from me was, I love when you were talking earlier about that importance of using our coaching skills for the investigation, but also then just echoing what you've just been sharing there about digging into the pain points and really exploring those and replaying things back, which again is that classic coaching technique of playback to people, can be really powerful in terms of clarifying. So again, great engagement here on the chat. So please keep those questions coming in. We've got a few minutes left in our call. So if there's any other questions that people want, then that'd be great to see those, and we'll come back to those final comments before we close. So back to you, Richard.
Great, thanks very much, Hayden. Yeah, well, we've got a few minutes to run now before we start winding things down. So let's look at the future and really, what trends are you noticing? What are you observing around the BBC and in the workplace around learning? So what does the future look like?
I think the future is about the immediacy of learning. So we're not in an age where we put a stamp on an envelope and send off it to the local college for their prospectus for an evening course on how to change a light bulb. We're in the age of the mobile technology. We want things immediately. We can get things immediately in our personal lives, but we can't necessarily do that in our work lives because we've often got cumbersome learning technologies and cumbersome ways of finding that. So I think the more personalised the learning, the more immediate it is. And I think I don't like the term micro-learning because I think learning is learning, but the more bite-sized the learning, the easier it is for someone to get what they need and then what they need quickly is key. So if I give you an example of that, imagine an online learning course that teaches you how to use a technical system. So say, for example, Adobe Photoshop, you might go through a course which shows you the basics, but actually all you wanted to do was be able to learn how to cut and paste. So we've got to have more searchable content that enables you to get exactly what you want at the point that you need it. I've heard a lot in learning about machine learning, about virtual reality. There's no doubt that there's places for those things, but I think my big thing is, let's not use technology for technology's sake. Let's use what's useful to the learner. Now, I can see virtual reality in some situations. So for BBC hostile environments, we do a 5-day course mimicking a hostile environment. I can see that virtual reality could do something to support that, but let's not use virtual reality for everything. So I think it's really digging into making learning useful to the learner. So for me, I think the future is about personalisation. I think it's about ease of access to learning. I think it is about making learning bite-sized, making it short. There is absolutely place. All learning should be quality, but it doesn't mean that a checklist or a simple piece of learning is less quality than a really glossy piece of virtual reality or a really glossy piece of e-learn. I think people are less patient, so they want to get to stuff quickly. So again, that leads back into that quick, easy access, bite size. I think people are more curious, so they're more, if the environment's right, if you've got the culture there, I think people are more curious and more interested in their own development. And I think that face-to-face element is still really important, but it's important in a different way. It's no longer the trainer standing up in front of the classroom. It's things like this. It's virtual sessions. It's drop-in clinics. It's floor walking. It's that face-to-face support at that point of need, not that I'll stand and preach to you. And actually, that means the reach of your traditional trainer goes far further. They become an enabler in learning. They facilitate conversations to happen. The other thing I think is we will see far more user-generated content. You know, we've got specialists in the business who are specialists at what they do, who are using the tools that we have every single day, day in, day out. So we need to find ways to harness that specialism more, to harness what they're reading, what they're doing, what's keeping them up to date, and use that as user-generated content. And I think that's going to be quite key for the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, that we could talk for another hour, I think, on all of those points that you made. And we started this conversation around the diversification of your own team, how you took that journey and, you know, upskilled them in new areas perhaps that they weren't familiar with. And I suppose that's the modern trainer, that's the modern L&D professional, moving around and navigating an organisation to, you know, meet the needs and meet the trends of the modern learner. I mean, if we look at how we consume many things in life, let's take media, and let's take Netflix. It may be a dirty word, I know, in the BBC.
I don't like to hear that word.
I'm sure. But other than things like Strictly, I mean, even Strictly you can catch up now, can't you? Or not?
Yeah.
And so,
you know, the whole media world is going into this on demand, when you want it, how you want it, on the device you want it. You know, we're not necessarily sitting and watching TV at a point in time at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night when EastEnders is on. We're watching it when it's convenient to us. And I think, you know, that's the biggest change, is that the world's changing around us. The world that we live in, the world that we are engaging with every day is changed. So we have an expectation, and often in the workplace, it's not meeting that same level, that same degree of speed, of efficiency, of you know, just being able to access to use Wikipedia, to use Google in that point in time. So that then makes learning have a bad name, really, because you're not being able to mimic the same experience. It just feels clunky, it feels old, it feels out of date. So it has to move quicker, it has to be better, it has to be delivered better. You know, I'd said technology not for technology's sake, but we have to find ways that we can mimic our personal lives within the workplace, so that we're feeling like learning is not out of date, that it's giving us something. So there's a real fine balance, and I think L&D is where the product world was at 10 years ago, and we have to move quickly to catch up. We've got to be keeping our, you know, I think they said at the Davos Forum a while ago that the skills of the future aren't invented yet. So we've got to be able to quickly reskill people and upskill people, and to do that we've got to have the right things and the right methods in place to do that.
So in one word, the prediction for future learning?
Simple, personalised. 2 words.
That's good. Great. Wow. Well, that was fantastic. I mean, we could continue this conversation on and on, but we are nearly up at time, unfortunately. So I'm going to pass back to Hayden now to take us through any final points in the chat box and to wrap up.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. So I've got a few very quick questions just to throw at you, Jenny. So just give us kind of your top of the head answer on this, because there's some quite big questions which I think people might want to think to more, but I'll give you these. So Katrina's asking, how can we make it easy for learners to find what they need? So what have you done that's made that information accessible? Do you have a learning management system?
We haven't. This is an area that we are struggling more with. In fact, it's one of our bigger challenges, because we do have a corporate system, and you know, that might not be the right way for us to deliver it. What we're looking at is creating a more personalised way of delivering the learning. We're looking at building something ourselves. We're lucky in that respect, and we've got lots of great people. And we're looking at and mapping it to our career path framework, so job roles and skills areas, so that you start to see information that's relevant to the role that you do. And I think this is where machine learning can be can be useful in the future is that we can then use the data of what people have been engaging with to push other content out to them. So yes, we're not there yet on the platform. What we do know is the learning experience platforms, these next generation platforms, feel like the right place to start. And that feels like they're adding something a bit different and something a bit, but what we're also very key on is just implementing a new platform won't change your culture. So what we're looking at is how people engage with our intranet, and how we create user journeys that feel part of the norm within the normal use of internal tools, rather than just saying, wow, here's a new platform, off you go and use it. So slightly more complicated in that perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. Great answer, great thoughts on that. Quick question from David Liversage. Again, probably not a quick question actually, but in the age of AI and VR, what more can we do to ensure that we keep being kind of human and allowing us to connect more? So given the fact that we've got technology, and I think you said earlier that let's not just use technology for the sake of it, but how do we keep that connection going?
Do you mean sort of in that sort of discursive, personalised way connection? If you do, I think things like this are brilliant because it's still keeping a discursive nature, but we're all in our own homes or our own workplaces. I think with AI has a real place. I'm thinking about imagine using broadcast equipment in a TV studio. At the moment, you might go and do a course, and you might someone might show you the tools. Actually, I think AI has a place in getting you up to speed with the basics. Imagine holding your phone up around the camera and it telling you how it works. Then you've got that human interaction, which becomes more of a mentoring and coaching interaction, which is how do you perfect your skill? So I think that's where the balance lies.
Yeah, great thoughts. I think it is absolutely that balance between where technology can aid, but then the human can add value to the experience. So one final question that's come through, which is how much has action learning become part of the mix, solving live business challenges that matter? So that real getting in, tackling a live issue and the learning experience that comes through that.
I'm not sure. I'd have to say, hold my hands up, I don't know that we've really gone into that realms yet, because we've been very much concentrated on transforming what we've got and buying the business into this change. I think that comes in our next phase. And actually, some of the conversations I've been having in the last couple of weeks feel like they're more on that live business problem, action learning type mantra, as opposed to we want this because we want to tell people that. So I think it's definitely the next phase for us, but I think what we're doing is forming that ability to be able to dive in.
Fantastic. Yeah, I couldn't echo more. That it's definitely got a place, I think, in the mix overall, and it's then how do you best utilise and how do you best capture the learning on the back of those activities that happen. So brilliant. Yeah. So some great questions and some great engagement. So thank you everybody who's on the call for that involvement in our session this afternoon. I just want to say a really big thank you to Jenny for pouring into this afternoon with all of your insight from your background, both as a marketeer and also within the learning profession. It's been fantastic to listen to some of the things you've been doing at BBC. So thank you.
Not a problem. And if anyone wants to ask any other questions, just drop me a link on LinkedIn and I'm happy to answer them.
Fantastic. And we will, if it's okay with you, Jenny, we'll share those details of your LinkedIn profile as we communicate afterwards. Thank you, Richard, for your wonderful hosting this afternoon. You did a great job for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jenny.
And so just before we close, everyone, so the recording of this afternoon's session will go onto our YouTube channel. So please do go on to our BrainFood YouTube channel, BrainFood Community YouTube channel, and you can get the recording. We'll also send it out to everybody who registered for this afternoon's call. So you will be able to go back over this great advice and guidance, and I'm sure you'll all want to have a look at that. If you have enjoyed this afternoon's session, then we'd love you to tell your friends about it. We are trying to grow the community around BrainFood. So if you've had a good experience this afternoon, we'd love you to share it with your colleagues, and feel free to forward on either the YouTube channel details or the email that we send you with the link to the recording, because we'd love as many people as possible to get the benefits of Jenny's wonderful advice this afternoon. So please do share. And if, while you're sharing, if you can go onto our social channels on Twitter and LinkedIn and also our Facebook pages, BrainFood Community, then we'd love to hear your views this afternoon and any comments that you've got. And if we can get a bit of a buzz around this afternoon session, that'd be wonderful. So please do, if you're not already following us on our social channels, then please do, and gain any comments or views would help us in terms of getting the word out. One just a very quick thing before we dial off. Our next BrainFood Live event is going to be on the 4th of December, which is only a few weeks away. It will be hosted in central London. We'll be sending out the details of the exact location very soon. But we're really excited to have a great evening session this time. So we're breaking away from our normal morning sessions to, since it's Christmas, be a little bit more social and have an evening session. So probably start around 4 p.m. With some input and some learning. But we're hoping also to have a little bit maybe of some wine tasting to entice people in, and then hopefully we can just have a real nice social connection and a drink ahead of our breaking off for the kind of Christmas holidays. So please, again, if you are available, 4th of December in central London, we'd love to see you there. And again, spread the word, tell your colleagues. If you know anybody who's interested in learning or personal development, then we'd love for them to come and join us as part of that next event. And Nicola, who's on board, who's going to be doing the wine tasting for us, has just put in whoop, bring on the wine. So we're a very excited person, looking forward to taking you through that. So that's our next event. We'd love to see as many of you as can in person. It'd be great to see you all. Just want to say a really big thank you for all of your time and attention this afternoon and joining this call. And again, once again, a big thank you to Jenny and Richard for taking us through. BrainFood is brought to you and sponsored by Mindset Leadership, and we're grateful to our sponsors. And we would just love to encourage you all to continue to be part of this great community and help us to spread the word and grow it. So thank you all. It's been lovely to see you all virtually this afternoon and experience this great conversation. And we look forward to welcoming you on a future In Conversation With. So have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And
I'll see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.